Good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you came in on such an incredibly beautiful day. It's hard to be inside, but it's going to be worth your while. So I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of the Alumni Association, and we're really excited about today's program. It's a new idea that the staff came up with, and it was originally, you know the TED Talks, right? How many have ever seen a TED Talk? Well, we thought it should be the Father TED Talks. But I'm telling you that it didn't fly with legal. So that's why it became Father Ted Said. And the idea behind it is pretty simple. We chose a topic that Father Ted was passionate about. Then we invited experts throughout the Notre Dame family to deliver very brief talks on a number of different aspects of the same topic. But while this seems pretty straightforward, the speakers today are really unbelievable. Our topic this afternoon is Notre Dame's lasting impact on peacebuilding and security. And our faculty members and alumni will speak today from their own true experience with this topic. And to introduce our speakers, I want to bring up our host for the event, Scott Appleby. Scott, I know it's going to be hard to believe when he comes out, Scott's celebrating his reunion with the class of 1978. He's the Marilyn Keough, Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. He's a professor of history. I'm pretty excited about it because I was a history major, a scholar of global religion, and has been a faculty member here since 1994. Before the launch of the Keough School, Scott Appleby, now Dean Appleby, served for 14 years as the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. So he has a really amazing resume. He's the perfect person for this. And so I just want to remind you at the end, my colleague, Mike Sullivan, will wrap this up. When he comes up, he's not yet another speaker. He's going to wrap it up, give a few instructions, and we'll have a video at the end. So without further ado, please welcome Dean Scott Appleby.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dolly. Were any of you at this event? A few people. So this is we think it's 1987. This is Father Ted offering Mass and blessing the War Memorial here on campus, also known as Stonehenge. What you don't see in this picture, because they're on this side of the camera, are the other participants in this event. These are faculty and students from the Peace Institute. So they were there as well, praying for the end of war and presumably for the obsolescence immediately of the military. So you had Father Ted blessing them all. Now, you know that Notre Dame is neither West Point nor Earlham College, which is not far from here, which is a wonderful Quaker institution. And yet, Father Ted liked to tell people, make the point, that Notre Dame has the largest ROTC program at a private university and also the largest and best endowed Peace Institute. And he blessed them both. That is typical Father Ted, typical Catholic. We know from an early age as Catholics that we are a both-and people. So Roman and Catholic, clergy and laity, nature and grace, faith and good works. And while we expect our salvation after we die and we look to another world, so to speak, Catholics believe that they are responsible for what goes on in this world as well. And so in this country, we've sent for many generations our sons and daughters into law, into the police force, into government, into statecraft, diplomacy, and into the military. That's very much a sense of being responsible for this world. And that both and really permeated Father Ted's understanding of how to approach the multiple dimensions of peace itself, how to think about that. When we get to the question of peace and its dimensions, peace and justice are interlocked, they're related, but they sometimes seem not to go together. The church tries to hold them in tension in its social teaching. So on one hand, we affirm that the preferential option, especially during the nuclear era, has been for nonviolent solutions to conflict. Diplomacy, discussion, dialogue, avoiding all forms of violence. And yet the church continues to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that there are some occasions in which war will be necessary to stop a potential aggressor, to secure a hard-won peace, but that war must always be for a just cause and prosecuted through just means. Father Ted himself, as you'll hear today, was very much an advocate of diplomacy and peace, and moved in the direction, as the popes of his time did, for this imperative of nonviolence. He was shaped in this attitude by so many things he did in his long and illustrious career, not least being the Vatican's permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Commission from 1956 to 1970, where it came home to him how devastating what he called the nuclear demon could be, the devil of nuclear weapons, and that he felt that was the biggest threat to everything else we all care about, peace and security and prosperity and freedom. So he committed himself, as you know, to that cause and to the cause of peace. As an educator, he thought that Notre Dame should be a leader in this cause, and he believed that we should lead the way, and remember this is in the middle of the Cold War, we should lead the way in bringing together, in his idea, Chinese and Russian, American, European diplomats, scholars, students, and faculty to discuss the different dimensions of peace, to kind of conduct a kind of university-based diplomacy. He shared this vision in 1986 in a talk at San Diego, and in the audience was a woman named Joan Kroc, and she was impressed with his vision for this dialogue through universities for peace, and the rest, as they say, is history. Father Ted also understood that peace, being multidimensional, was connected to so many things. It's not just about war and peace. It's also about what are the conditions in the world that lead to war. So famine, hunger, poverty, discrimination. There was bad governance. He saw these problems as interconnected. And so he brought that sensibility back from the world, so to speak, to Notre Dame, and he began to establish, during this period, a number of institutes on campus, and he saw them all as drawing on all the disciplines. So he established these alongside our kind of traditional disciplines, political science, history, economics, biology, and these departments. These institutes were established alongside these, using many of the faculty to bring them together around topics like peace and justice, civil and human rights, development and democracy. So the Kroc Institute, the Keough Institute, the Center for Civil and Human Rights, he established with one vision in mind, a kind of synoptic vision of how these should work together. And that vision became the seed of the Keough School of Global Affairs, the Donald R. Keough School of Global Affairs. We've been working to build this school, planning it, recruiting students and faculty for 4 years now, and last August, 2017, we opened the doors of Jenkins Nanovic Hall to the first class of new Masters of Global Affairs students, 38 professional students from 23 countries. They will be joined in August by another cohort of that size. We also have a number of undergraduate programs in global affairs, and the Kroc Institute continues to run a very successful Ph.D. program in peace, and it partners with several disciplines like political science, sociology, theology, and others. So there's a full range of curricular offerings in this new Keough School that really reflect Father Ted's vision of bringing these disciplines together to solve problems that are all related to some form of peace and justice. The Keough School is not an NGO, it's not a think tank, it's certainly not a government agency or a corporation. It is embedded and very much a part of a leading national and now international research university, Notre Dame, and our job is to conduct research and scholarship and teaching that will inform the various sectors, government, the private sector, the NGO world. How do those sectors change the world? How do we inform that process? How do we educate the policymakers? How do we ourselves do scholarship that's policy relevant, that changes the world? That's the vision of the Keough School. Let me give you one example of that. I could give you several. Some of you may have heard of the Peace Accords matrix that the Peace Institute has been working on now for 15 years. The acronym is PAM. What's the problem? It starts with research. The problem was 15 years ago, we recognized that almost half of the peace accords signed since the end of the Cold War around the world fail within 5 years. So there are dozens of shooting wars around the world. Why do half of those settlements collapse within 5 years? So our researchers, we hired at the Kroc Institute a number of young, very savvy, quantitative analysts who got together all of the provisions of the various accords that have been signed. And some of these peace accords are 200, 300 pages with hundreds of provisions. How do you decommission soldiers? How do you integrate them back into society? What do you do with their arms? How do you build a new judicial system after the war, and so on? And they analyzed and coded these provisions. And so there's a big database that you can say, how did they do it in the Basque Country or in Mindanao or in Northern Ireland? What was successful and what was unsuccessful? And now that project not only is based in the research here, but it has practitioners and mediators live on the ground in conflict settings using this data to craft better, more effective peace accords. The really wonderful breakthrough for this project, as you may know, is in the Colombian conflict, the longest running conflict, civil war in this hemisphere, over 50 years. And the peace accords, the PAM team from the Keough School, the Kroc Institute from Notre Dame, is working now to oversee the implementation of the peace accords. They were mentioned, the Kroc Institute and Notre Dame, 7 times in that peace treaty, and the Nobel laureate, President Santos of Colombia, mentioned the Kroc Institute in his Nobel laureate speech. Our advisor at Kroc for many years, Jack Mullen, used to say, Kroc is going to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. And we kind of said, yeah. Well, we came close. That was pretty cool. I'm going to conclude my remarks so I can introduce the other speakers with one anecdote about Father Ted and Don Keough, who really are the patrons of the Keough School and who take forward, which tries to advance the vision they both shared. They were friends and colleagues for many years, Don and Ted, and they worked together, and they were both charming and very dedicated, very smart, and they did not stop, did not relent in achieving their objectives. I had the honor, not long before Don Keough died, to visit him in his office in Atlanta, and we were exchanging memories of Father Ted. And Father Ted was still alive at the time, because these gentlemen left us within a week of one another when they passed away a few years ago. And so Don was talking about Father Ted. We were reminiscing, and he told me this story. He said, in the early 80s, I became the CEO of Coca-Cola. And Father Ted called me up, it just happened at the same time, and said, Don, the university needs you. We need you to become the chair of our board of trustees. You're a layman. That's a very important position for Notre Dame at this time in its history. No one else can do that but you. You've got to come and help us do this for me, for the university. Don Keough said to me, I said, Father, I love you. I love the university. I'd love to do this at any other time. But I just took on the biggest job of my life. I'm overwhelmed. I couldn't do both of these jobs well. So Don Keough says to me, so Father Ted said, well, at least let me fly down and celebrate Mass for you and Mickey and the kids and family and colleagues at Coca-Cola. Don Keough looks at me and says, what am I supposed to say? No, you can't come celebrate Mass. So he did. He flew down. Father Ted flew down, says a Mass. You can imagine the scene, everyone crowded around as he's offering Mass, kind of like this. And what's the homily? Don Keough tells me. The homily is, what the gospel says today, really, this life is just a prelude to eternal life. That's what it's really about. So let's imagine what it would be like when we die, and we go before St. Peter at the pearly gates. Imagine, say, Don Keough is in that situation. This is a homily. And Don Keough goes before St. Peter, and St. Peter says, well, Don, what do you have to say for yourself? What have you done with your talents and resources and your brains? And Don may say, well, I was the CEO of Coca-Cola. And St. Peter may kind of raise an eyebrow, shrug his shoulders. But if Don said, I was the chair of the board of our Lord's Mother's University, the doors are going to fling wide open. That was the homily. Don kind of threw his arms out and said, what am I supposed to do? I became the chair of the board of trustees. We have a wonderful series of speakers for you today. Let me introduce them briefly. The first one is George Lopez, who is the Hesburgh Chair of Peace Studies, Emeritus. You'll notice, by the way, how sharply dressed George is today. Take notice of that. George has been professor at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame for many years. He is a scholar of researching policy alternatives to war, including smart sanctions. He and David Courtwright were very influential in the 90s and beyond in finding alternatives to conflict through sanctioning oppressive regimes. George has been very involved in that and in other policy work. He's also been a terrific teacher and mentor, especially of undergraduates. I know because his office was across the hall from mine, there was a constant flow of undergraduates who he's helped shape and form in peace studies. No one gave more energy or talent to that. So you're going to hear first from George. Following George is Mike Desch. Mike is the Pecky J.D. Professor of Political Science and one of our really important faculty leaders. Mike is the founding director of the Notre Dame International Security Program, and through his leadership, it has become now a vital center of discussion and debate about grand strategy. How should the military help secure democracy and protect our interests? What's appropriate, what's not appropriate? Mike leads that conversation. And he, like the military, takes on jobs that other people take for granted and they need very much and they don't want to do. I'll give you an example. Mike has just finished being the lead person to review the decennial review of the academic articles of the university. This is harder than war. This is a tough assignment, and Mike pulled it off. So you'll hear from him after George. Then we have Nell Bolton. Nell Bolton is a wonderful friend and a graduate of the Kroc Institute in the Masters of Peace Studies program back in 2003. Nell is the kind of person we knew when she was a student. She would embody Father Ted's favorite line from St. Thomas Aquinas, opus justitia pax. That is, the work of peace is justice. And Nell does that as the senior technical advisor for justice and peace building at Catholic Relief Services around the world. So she'll tell us about that. Following Nell is Jude Ash. Jude is a doctoral student in that joint program I referred to before, Peace Studies and Psychology. He also got his master's degree at Notre Dame in Peace Studies and an undergraduate degree in engineering in his native Syria. Jude is from Syria. He was an opponent of the Syrian regime who in 2011 was arrested and tortured and then exiled from Syria. And he turned that traumatic experience into service for others who have been traumatized by founding the organization and serving as its chair, the New Syrian Human, working in the region for those who have been oppressed and traumatized. So you'll hear about that experience from Jude. Last but not least, Tona Boyd, another terrific graduate who really reflects the kind of security and peace dynamic, political science major, peace studies undergraduate major as well. Again, we knew that Tona would do great things. She was the kind of undergraduate that we are spoiled here at Notre Dame we come to expect. Skilled, brilliant, balanced, articulate, really a terrific student, and of course she has gone on to do great things. She is currently federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice for Civil Rights, and it can be now announced today she will soon become senior counsel for the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is quite an appointment. So you've got a great lineup, and you're going to enjoy it. Go Irish.
Unless peace begins on that small microcosm of a person's own life, there's not much hope of spreading it out to China and Russia and Japan and South America and Africa. But if you're a person of peace, and you're dedicated to peace, and you're willing to pray for peace, and you're willing to sacrifice for peace, then I think we can cast out this devil that I call the nuclear threat to humanity.
Notre Dame Hesburgh Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies, George Lopez.
Isn't it amazing that Scott and I were able to change shirts right at the same time? That's what he meant. Good afternoon. When Father Ted invited me in 1986 to come to the university to be helpful with the creation of the Kroc Institute, one of the things that struck me is the way he emphasized the size and scope of this. I had been I thought, reasonably successful teacher of peace studies at the famous Earlham College that Scott mentioned earlier, and had felt like I was making good contributions to the field. But Father Ted's vision, of course, was a place that not only would do teaching at a new level, but also research and also policy significance. And that dynamic, interactive triangle was going to require a kind of dedication that led me to try to re-examine, am I dedicated enough? Do I have the time? The personal and professional challenges that this involved really were stunning to me the more I thought about it. Should I say yes? Well, fortunately I did, and I think we've tried to do some good things over the last 32 years that I've been associated with this marvelous university, the Kroc Institute, and now the Keough School. But one of the things that struck me first about this dedication of the full life of dealing with peace really hit me as a teacher and an educator. You see, I had felt that often I'd go into a classroom, about this size, this number of people. You're supposed to laugh at that. And my approach would be, I wonder who's the one? Who's the one in here who's going to become the Assistant Secretary of State, or be the commando of NATO forces, or to be the journalist at the height of the discussion of crisis. And that person's ideas would make a difference as to whether or not there's going to be war or peace, whether or not there'd be use of nuclear weapons or not in a particular crisis. And if I did my job as a faculty person, that one person at that critical moment, maybe 30 years after they were in my classroom, they'd say the thing that made the difference. And of course, they'd be thinking, as Professor Lopez said, So the peace teaching challenge and the dedication that you needed for that began to change for me. And what did Father Ted charge us with doing? As Scott mentioned, creation of a professional, marvelous program for peace builders in an intense environment of learning, teaching, and living together that hadn't really been a model used before. But there was something else. In the teaching of a wide range of undergraduates here, my colleagues and I learned that the new peace building that we were trying to envision as a way to get to that non-nuclear world, to get to a world of peace, just didn't involve the specialists. It also had to involve the marvelous Notre Dame undergraduates who were here because they were passionate about becoming a doctor, an architect, an accountant, a lawyer, a parent. What that meant is that we had to translate the research findings and the approaches that we used in dealing with specialists and make it the new citizenship education of our time. And that challenge really imposed a new dedication on us to have the finger on the pulse of you all as undergraduate and graduate students to try to make that translation. And that was a marvelous experience for me. It made me a far better collegiate teacher than I ever would have been otherwise. And then there was the research angle. Scott mentioned that in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, my good colleague and friend David Courtwright and I were looking at this changing dynamic. I mean, the Cold War had just ended. We were looking for how would the world now solve disputes in the midst of a world of increased globalization and the economies of the world changing. There no longer being a kind of east-west divide. And the UN Security Council's action at Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait was to impose economic sanctions. They'd only done that twice since 1945, and in each case, not very effectively. The use of economic sanctions as a way to end war or to denuclearize a particularly aggressive power became a real theme of the 1990s and early 2000s. And particularly in that decade of the 2000s, we found that the UN imposed economic sanctions a dozen times in that one decade. Our research became deeply involved with a number of governments that were testing out this new dynamic, and particularly the United Nations. In the right kind of Notre Dame approach to this, we were interested not only in the technical and economic and military dimensions of this, but particularly charged by people early on at the UN with how do you solve the dilemma that innocent people with general economic sanctions are hurt, not the leaders. That ethical dynamic, the human dynamic, pushed us to the edge and made us part of a small group of people worldwide who created what you now hear are targeted or smart sanctions. That is, the sanctions that were devised to financially constrain and work on bad leaders, and only those leaders, and have very little ripple effects down to the general population. That led us to be consultants to a wide variety of governments and to play a role over the last 25 years now in sanctions research for peace building that I think none of us would have thought possible. It reverberated very, very well back to the Kroc Institute, and now even more so to the Keough School in some marvelous ways. The policy dimension hit me in a way I didn't expect as a result of our research. In 2010, I got a call from the State Department, and they said, we'd like you to take a seat that's for the United States on the UN Security Council panel of experts for monitoring and implementing the sanctions on North Korea. It was almost an overwhelming opportunity. Through the good graces of Scott and various others, I was able to take an extra leave to be able to do this. And when people ask me what the experience was like, I sometimes say, well, with David and our colleagues doing 6 books and 40 articles about sanctions, we felt like the maitre d' of international sanctions. And I'd just been involved in a request to go to the sausage factory. The sausage factory of watching how sanctions play out on the ground, on what humanitarian impact might actually mean, on how you devise ways where the dike is leaking in so many places to plug holes. But it led to some interesting critical reflection back on what's the meaning of peace if these measures are designed to try to get there. Are the targeted financial sanctions that we're developing working, and how do we know? And then a particularly poignant moment when we were overseas working with a series of countries in a regional forum about how you tighten the sanctions in appropriate ways. We had some really difficult meetings. We came back to the hotel, my team and I, an international team, and my young Chinese colleague grabbed me by the shoulder and he said, I don't know why you continue to hate North Korea. And I said, you know, I don't think I'm hating North Korea here. What are we discovering here at this forum and the missions we had before? We're discovering the illicit finance, the illegal movement of uranium, the trade illegally in gyroscopes and guiding devices for missiles to launch ICBMs to other countries. I said, you in China and we in the United States and we in the UN, our task is to disrupt these illicit international networks that are fomenting greater nuclear proliferation. Let's help develop a security system for North Korea that keeps them safe, keeps them without nuclear threat, and maybe they won't develop their own systems, but they're only the latest client. What we need to do is choke off the networks. That's the goal we have. China, the UN, and the US, that's our goal. In silence, he left my room. And then I began to reflect further, because I was only 3 months away from coming back. And I realized that in the process of that policy work that Notre Dame had granted me an exception to be able to go do, my definition of what's the threat to peace had changed. It's not so much that's one country that's an enemy of another country, which is then a friend of somebody else who's somebody's enemy. It's rather the international crime and corruption and illicit networks that undercut the state peace and security system. So I came back to Notre Dame in 2011, deciding that what I would do in Intro to Peace Studies is talk about crime and corruption as the new great threat of peace. And the accountants and the economists and the architects and the people interested in environmental biology, which was going to take them across national boundaries, they said, oh, that makes sense. And so I had watched in the space of 20 plus years the charge of dedication that Father Ted gave us in coming to create the Kroc Institute, of that linkage between teaching, research, and policy, had come true for me in a marvelous way. The circle even continues some more. Mike Desch will be out in a little bit. David, myself, a number of Notre Dame students, Jerry Powers, were able to be part of an audience and a symposium with the Pope in November of this past 2017, where the Pope really was in the lead in saying, look, the new level of modernization of weapons that's planned by a number of nations has to be considered for its moral significance. We have a world, like the Integral Human Development Challenge that the Keough School gives us, in which development, poverty, environmental crisis, those are the threats to people's security. They need to be addressed with aid and billions of dollars. To put billions of new dollars into the development of new and modernized weapon systems creates a grave moral crisis. And I thought back to that moment in 1986 when Father Ted said, this devil is something that we need to be challenged. The problems 32 years later are taking new form, but they're the same ones. I've been uniquely privileged to be part of a Kroc Institute and now a Keough School that deals with these in the shadow of the dome and the shadow of the lady that sits on the top, with Notre Dame graduates who in their own communities, in their own ways, and 500 master's candidates from the Kroc School working back in their own countries that have had this new challenge of peace that they've met. Thank you very much.
We are the largest private trainer of officers for the Navy, Army, Navy, and Air Force, and Marines. It seems to me that we're always going to have an Army. It's in the Constitution. And an Army is as good as its officers. And I would much rather have in the armed forces, which we are going to have, officers trained with a sense of value, a sense of peace. I'd say if we're going to have armed forces, and the armed forces are going to reflect the wisdom of the officers and their concern for peace and nonviolence, I'd rather have them from Notre Dame than from Podunk, or whatever Podunk might be. And I think I can honestly say, and I've heard this 1,000 times from people in the Pentagon, that our officers give fine service, intelligent service, all over the world with great integrity, and I don't apologize for that. I think it's a service to our country, which is a good service.
Please welcome Notre Dame Professor of Political Science and Director of the Notre Dame International Security Center, Mike Desch.
Thank you. Let me start out by welcoming all the Notre Dame alumni back for this reunion weekend, particularly those of you in the class of 1968. The great 68, joining my good friend Tom Durkin in celebrating your 50th reunion. Boy, that's quite a benchmark to make. I come from an old Notre Dame family myself. My father was class of 1953, and my grandfather, class of 1923, played football and ran track for Newt Rockne. And when I tell people that I have that genetic background in me, they give me a strange look because they don't see any evidence of that in me today. But then they remember from their freshman biology the concept of the deeply recessive gene, and they sort of shake their head in recognition. Now, I'm not an alum of Notre Dame. My act of youthful rebellion was to go to Marquette rather than to follow my father and grandfather here. But the great wheel of karma has turned, and now I've ended up here as part of the hired help. And in fact, I'm thrilled to be here. In fact, I was at the Bush School, part of the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library, when the call came to come to Notre Dame. And it was a hard choice, I'll be candid with you. I was working with former President George H.W. Bush, or the good Bush, as we called him. as opposed to another Bush. And Bob Gates was the president of the university before he went back and served as Secretary of Defense, not only for a Democratic administration, or for a Republican administration, but also a Democratic administration. And one of the things I did at the Bush School was found the Scowcroft Institute for International Affairs. So I got to know General Brent Scowcroft, George H.W. Bush's very close friend and confidant. So, you know, for somebody who was interested, as I am, in national security affairs, being at the Bush School was, as we used to say in Texas, like being a pig in mud. I was pretty happy there. But why did I come to Notre Dame? Aside from, of course, the family connection, there were two elements that really attracted me. One, of course, was what my boss, Dean John McGreevy, and I hope you'll all report that I'm endorsing this. He famously gave a talk that was a video about the Notre Dame experiment, about trying to craft an excellent university that was both excellent in terms of secular standards for a university, but also was thoroughly infused with the Catholic mission. And that challenge is a pretty exciting one to be a part of, and one I think that all the members of the faculty here at Notre Dame will tell you we live every day striving to achieve that. So that was one draw. But a second draw was Notre Dame's historically close relationship with the U.S. military. And I'm sure you all know the broad outlines of the story, beginning at least with Father William Corby serving as the chaplain to the 99th New York Brigade at the Battle of Gettysburg. You know where the term the Fighting Irish came from? It was the 99th New York Brigade, made up mostly of Irish immigrants who would go into battle and fight to maintain the Union of the United States. But this tradition continued with the V-12 program, the Navy program for commissioning officers during the Second World War, which would literally save Notre Dame at a time when a lot of men's colleges were in deep trouble because all the men had gone off to war. And culminating in the fact that during the Vietnam War, a war that tore our country apart politically, almost alone among elite universities, Notre Dame did not consider abolishing its strong ROTC program on campus. And in fact, as Scott Appleby mentioned in his remarks, Notre Dame has one of the largest ROTC programs at any private university, covering all three of the services, Army, Navy, and Air Force. Now, Father Hesburgh, for me, epitomizes that iconographic logo that's above the east door on the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, the World War I War Memorial, God, country, and Notre Dame. And think about it. Father Hesburgh was ordained a priest at the beginning of the Second World War. And according to his autobiography, what he wanted to do was serve as a Navy chaplain. But his superior said, no, I have a tougher combat role for you. I want you to be chair of the theology department at Notre Dame. But Father Hesburgh never lost that connection for the military. You know undoubtedly that after the war, a lot of the young men who would have been in college during the war came back to Notre Dame as married veterans. And Father Hesburgh saw as an integral part of his ministry serving as chaplain to Vetville, the veterans' housing that stood just north of where the Hesburgh Library is today. And what's interesting about Father Hesburgh, and a number of people who'll be speaking today will touch on this theme of his ongoing commitment to both peace and maintaining strong commitments with the U.S. military. So Father Hesburgh, as both Scott and George had mentioned, was really the founding force behind the establishment of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And that's one of his major but many legacies that you see on campus today. But at the same time that Father Hesburgh was advancing Catholic social teaching and a commitment to peace, he was also deeply engaged with the U.S. military. And he would recount stories of, for example, celebrating Mass on a nuclear submarine underway from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, where there's the famous story about Father Hesburgh doing a favor for President Jimmy Carter and then coming to him afterwards and saying, "Father, I'm so grateful to you, what can I do for you?" And Father Hesburgh had something he wanted President Carter to do for him. He wanted to arrange a flight in an SR-71 Blackbird, the most secret, most sensitive spy plane that we had at the time. And I met with Father Hesburgh in his office a year or so after I got here, and he had many mementos of his time working with the troops. But the space helmet that he had to wear with the pressure suit during that SR-71 flight was one of his proudest mementos of the U.S. military. And so the idea that Notre Dame and the military were inextricably linked, and peace and military service were not mutually incompatible, is a really important legacy of Notre Dame, and one that I found personally quite attractive. I started out early in my career not being sure if I wanted to pursue a career in government or to become an academic. And for a few years early on, I worked in Washington. I worked on the Hill a couple of times, and I worked in the intelligence community. But I ultimately ended up going back to the University of Chicago and getting a Ph.D. And spending most of my professional life thinking about issues of national security from the perspective of a scholar, not so much a policymaker. Although I always felt that this distinction between what we do in the university and what goes on in the rest of the world is an artificial one, and one that in fact would be really important to try to break down the barriers between these two things. So when I came in the fall of 2008, my colleagues and I put together a program called the Notre Dame International Security Program that Scott had mentioned. And the idea was that we would try to serve as a bridge between the best work that was being done here on campus at Notre Dame relevant to issues of national security and strategy and things like that, and the most important issues that policymakers were facing in Washington. And 2 years ago, we sort of fell into a little bit of money, and we were able to expand NDISC into NDISC, the Notre Dame International Security Center. And what does the center do? Well, we try to foster the cutting-edge social science research on problems relevant to the most pressing issues that national security leaders face today. So that's our own research. But we also committed ourselves very strongly to training the next generation of national security policymakers. So we've established an undergraduate international security policy certificate program that is primarily directed at undergraduates, and through a combination of curricular and extracurricular activities, trains Notre Dame students to assume positions in national security affairs, sort of broadly defined. Now, this sort of program is really important because there is, a very strong ROTC contingent and presence on campus today that's preparing young women and men for service in national security in uniform. But there's also quite a bit, many positions in government which are filled by civilians. And given that fewer and fewer Americans today have experience with the military in uniform, it's very important to be able to give these young people who are going to pursue these careers sort of hands-on experience that in another generation they would have had from serving in uniform as well. So we have a picture up here, I call it Beauty and the Beast. It's a young woman who's a student in our program who went on NDISC's spring break trip last year to the Marine Air-Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms in California. And it's that sort of opportunity to not only study in class and in coursework national security issues, but also to get out to meet the troops, spend time with them in the field, learn the craft that provides them with the sort of expertise that they're going to need to assume the positions that Notre Dame women and men will take in government and in other areas of international security. Finally, NDISC is committed to being a place on campus and in our community in which we bring together current and former senior policymakers and the campus community to talk about some of the big issues that the country is grappling with these days. So, for example, last fall, we had General Mike Hayden, who was former director of CIA, former director of the National Security Agency, and author of a much discussed current book on intelligence and policy making, as one of our speakers on campus. And just by coincidence, we did it the Friday before a home football game in the fall, and 80,000 of our closest friends and relatives were in town for that event anyhow, so we had a terrific turnout. A couple of years back, we had General Martin Dempsey, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military advisor to the president and the Civilian National Command Authority, gave a very well-attended lecture on campus as well. We do work with various elements of the U.S. government and the intelligence community to provide an outside civilian perspective on the issues that our country faces. We want to be a voice for a broader perspective on the big policy issues that we're engaging today. So Father Hesburgh said in that video vignette at the beginning of my talk that Notre Dame has sought to provide good service by its close links with the U.S. military. And we, my colleagues and I in NDISC, feel that we're continuing that tradition of good service for Notre Dame through fostering discussion education, debate, and experiential learning in the area of national security. So let me again welcome you back to your alma mater. It's a great weekend. Dolly Duffy and her colleagues in the alumni office always get perfect weather for this weekend. So enjoy the weekend, and thank you for all that you do for Notre Dame.
Out of our fundamental humanity, if you will, we can understand the beauty of other people, the sincerity and the search for God in other religions, the values that we share to make life more livable, more humane, and are even working together to make a better world. There are too many poor in this world. There are too many hungry. There are too many homeless. There are too many frightened children. There are too many deaths that are violent. Together we can all work on these, and it would be so much better to be working together in that framework rather than shooting at each other across stone fences.
Please welcome Justice and Peacebuilding Senior Technical Advisor of Catholic Relief Services, Nell Bolton.
In the summer of 2005, I was living in Nigeria, working on peace and justice issues with Catholic Relief Services there and around Central Africa. I had the chance to work with wonderful local organizations that were committed to peace, to good governance, to human dignity. It was amazing and meaningful and fulfilling work, and I had no intention of leaving it. But when Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent levee failures devastated my hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana, I soon knew that I needed to return back home. I couldn't, with any integrity, keep working on peace and justice in other societies when we so clearly had issues of our own to deal with. And so within a few months, I found myself on my way back home. And I soon plunged in to great collaborative efforts to try to ensure that everyone, but especially the poor and the marginalized and the displaced, had a voice and a place in the recovery of New Orleans. And what these experiences affirmed for me was the power of people to transcend barriers and divisions in pursuit of the common good. This was a time when emotions were raw and tensions were running high in the wake of so much loss and so much heartache. There was a lot of fear and distrust on all parts. Effective public leadership was essentially absent, which left the burden for driving the recovery forward on the shoulders of regular, everyday people. And yet, what I witnessed time and again were people who were willing to cross barriers that they rarely would have crossed before, to move into other neighborhoods and sit down with other people who were sharing similar experiences, but from very different historical backgrounds, and figure out common solutions to the problems that they faced together. I saw people being willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt just long enough to figure out those workable solutions. And one of the biggest barriers to return being housing and the ability to have a place to live. We spent a lot of time working on affordable housing, especially for the renters who are left out of many of the rebuilding programs and funding cycles. And it was perhaps surprising, but we found very diverse partners in these coalitions, people from very different economic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, neighborhood backgrounds, who are willing to come together and collaborate on these efforts. This was an affirmation to me of the ability of people as citizens, as human beings, to work together for the common good, to deal with division, disagreement, difference, but to do it in a way that allows us to hash those things out and then move forward. And this felt significant to me at the time, not just for New Orleans, but for American life more generally. This was in the mid-2000s when the TV show Survivor was at the peak of its popularity. What that show and many of the cultural messages behind it were saying was that if you didn't like someone, you didn't have to deal with them. You didn't have to engage with them, much less try to find compromise with them. You just voted them off the island. And I thought this was a troubling indicator of how we, in our civic life, were dealing with difference and with disagreement. We were beginning to sort of slip down a slippery slope towards a standard mode in which demonization and polarization were the order of the day. This troubled me then, and it troubles me even more so now. After all, no society expects to slip off a cliff into civil war. No one expects that the too many violent deaths will one day become massive casualties. And certainly there are political and economic forces that drive war. But a powerful antidote to the centrifugal forces that pull societies apart, that tear people apart from one another, are opportunities to collaborate, opportunities to explore and discover and affirm the common good. So one of our most fundamental responsibilities as peace builders is to create pathways for people to find avenues to identify and discover and act on their commonalities and the things that hold them together. I've been back at CRS for several years now, and one of the most powerful pathways that we've found for doing this is something that we call the 3 B's: binding, bonding, and bridging. Binding refers to the process of personal healing, self-transformation. It literally is about giving people the opportunity to bind up their own deep emotional and psychic wounds, the wounds to their own sense of fundamental humanity, and helping them to discover and activate their own capacities for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for leadership. Bonding, the next B, is about working within our own groups to hash out the issues and the differences and the disagreements that we may have. We all know that sometimes those tensions can be most heated among the people that we're closest to, members of our own networks, members of our own religious or ethnic groups. And bonding creates a safe space for exploring those and finding and building consensus. And the final B, bridging, is about reaching out and building dialogue and collaboration across the divisions that separate groups from one another, that keep them polarized. Bridging, it can be everything from opportunities to come together and have these dialogues, as well as acts of cooperation, including the literal act of building a bridge in a community, repairing a school, or launching a business together with people who are on opposite sides of a conflict situation. We've seen that taken together, these 3 B's can make a fundamental shift in the conflict landscape. We've seen in Bosnia-Herzegovina survivors of wartime trauma become models and advocates for reconciliation across ethnic divides. We're even seeing some political leaders begin to follow suit at local and national levels. In South Sudan, we've had community members tell us that even a single workshop that helped them to process their own trauma, to strengthen their self-care, to explore concepts around forgiveness and leadership, has made significant differences in how they're dealing with conflict and violence in their own homes, and how much cooperation there is between ethnic groups, different ethnic groups within their communities. In Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, we've worked with traditional and religious leaders to discover and strengthen the personal and spiritual capabilities that they bring. And with that empowerment, they have been effectively resolving intractable land conflicts that often run a risk of turning violent. We've also seen that young people who have participated in bridging activities that unite them are using their new relationships, their new attitudes, their new skills to change the way that they're engaging with authority figures and contributing to their own communities. We've even seen impacts of this 3B process among officials at quite higher levels. For example, government officials, militia leaders who have participated in these processes in Central African Republic are bringing those experiences into higher level negotiations. All of this is a reminder, I think, to me, that the 3Bs give us a way to connect with and strengthen our shared sense of interdependence, our sense of our fundamental humanity, the belief and the experience that we can actually find ways to work together across those stone walls rather than shooting at one another. And this gives me hope. Thank you.
Part of the movement towards peace, I hope, which again is bringing good out of evil of a present situation, is to convince people, especially young people, that you can't create peace unless you're at peace yourself within your family, with your mother and father or your sisters and brothers, with your neighbors and your classmates, with the nation in which you live, that you're not torn apart on a lot of special interests, but you're committed to what we call the common good of everyone, with your global neighbors, if you will.
Please welcome Kroc Institute Ph.D. student and CEO of New Syrian Human, Jude Ash.
Here, the walls have ears. That is what my uncle told me when I first returned to Syria after being raised abroad. If you ever see a statue for the president, he said, turn away. Do not criticize. Watch your every thought, lest you be sent behind the sun to suffer a horrific death. Uncle, I said, you're so dramatic. But a former prisoner himself, my uncle knew very well what happened to those who dared to speak out in a place where citizens were considered little more than sheep in a herd, expected only to obey, deprived of their rights to act, think, or even dream, independent of the omnipotent and omniscient tyrant. He also knew very well that I would not listen. After decades of suffering horrific repression, and inspired by a recent wave of unprecedented protests unfolding in the Middle East, the Syrian people finally decided to speak out. On the 18th of March, 2011, a group of Syrian children painted 4 words of graffiti on their school wall. "Your turn has come, doctor," it said, referring to their ophthalmologist regime president, Bashar al-Assad. 4 words ignited a spark that set the country ablaze and changed Syria forever. When videos flooded Facebook and YouTube showing protesters shot in cold blood by snipers in the streets and the bodies of children mutilated by torture, I, like millions of other Syrians, could no longer repress this need to speak out. So, in the southern city of Sueda, in Syria, I joined a group of my friends to organize nonviolent protests calling for freedom, dignity, and human rights. These protests were unprecedented. In over 50 years, our city had not witnessed such a public display of dissent. Almost all of us who participated had never before experienced what it felt like to freely express your opinion in the street. Syrians had many grievances, but we could only articulate our demands in 2 words that formed the spirit around which Syrians later mobilized: Hurriye, freedom, and Karame, dignity. I remember very well when I first chanted for Hurriye and Karame in the street. Hurriye lil-abad, ghasban annak, ya Asad. Freedom forever, like it or not, Assad. I understood then just how precious freedom and dignity really are, and how interrelated. You see, without the ability to express yourself freely, independent of collective authority, without the belief that you are worthy and capable of being the change you want to see in this world, we lose precisely that which makes us human. Without freedom and dignity, there is no peace. Yet, as my uncle had warned, this decision to express yourself freely in the street and demand the rights of your fellow citizens proved very costly. In August 2011, I was arrested from a peaceful demonstration. As punishment for speaking politics, I got to visit the dreaded land beyond the sun, which turned out to be underground torture chambers. Not as creative, I guess. In any case, I made it out alive, only after realizing that, boy, my uncle was not exaggerating. Many of my friends, however, were not so lucky. Released only under condition of permanent exile, I have not stepped foot in the country I call home or seen the people I once loved, including my family, in over 6 years, and I probably never will. Yet, we were all fully aware of the consequences when we took to the streets, defying one of the most barbaric regimes in recent history, with little more than our claim to justice. What we did not expect, however, was just how alone we were going to be in this struggle. After exile, you see, we Syrians never really asked for much. All we wanted was to live in freedom and dignity and peace. Let not the haze of chaos and war and propaganda lead you astray. It is for freedom and dignity and peace that over 500,000 Syrians have been slaughtered and over 12 million displaced, while the entire world either watched in silence or acted in complicity. After exile and no longer able to join my sisters and brothers in the streets, I traveled across the Middle East, leaving a budding career in engineering in Dubai. My mom was not happy about it. Hi, Mom. So I traveled across the Middle East to work with Syrian refugees in their refugee communities. And I traveled across Turkey and Lebanon and worked closely with Syrians for over 5 years. During those years, I got to know my fellow Syrians, their needs and their communal dynamics in ways that only a local can. Despite devastating individual and collective trauma, the Syrian refugee communities were bristling with potential. Thousands of people with the ability and will to create change. One very good example was Maryam, a Syrian torture and rape survivor. When I first met Maryam in Turkey, she was understandably broken. After hearing her story, and with tears in my eyes, I asked her, "What can we do to help Maryam?" You would expect that she asked for food, shelter, or even money to feed her children. Yet, while she desperately needed all of these, I was shocked to hear her say that she wanted to get up on her feet and start a woman-led business to help other women in the community. And Maryam wasn't alone in this. A survey we conducted in the region revealed that the Syrian refugee community's greatest need was not for food, not shelter, not money. While they needed all of that, what they really needed was jobs and sources of livelihood, so they are able to provide for their families in dignity. Unfortunately, however, by and large, with few exceptions, including CRS, the multi-billion-dollar industry of international aid was not built to listen to local people. While working in Syrian refugee communities, I came to see what I can only describe as a donor-driven, dependency-based model of aid, in which international organizations look to donors as points of reference, not the people they serve. and view local populations as little more than passive recipients whose only role is to wait in line for the white Western angel on a unicorn to come down from the cloud and save them. What this model failed to see, and indeed actively crushed, were the enormous resources existing and already available in these communities. So, in the spirit of the Syrian saying that goes, "Only your own nail can scratch your back," I joined a group of amazing Syrians and founded a people-driven, empowerment-based Syrian international nonprofit with a mission to empower local communities to lead their own processes of change. Our dream was to bridge the international and the local. Our method of operation, we called it community-based empowerment, was to identify and empower what we call existing strategic leverages of change, and that is leaders and institutions in the local communities, and empower them to create organic, cost-effective, and sustainable processes of change that not only impact individuals, but communities, structures, and even cultures. We named it after what we sought to build. We wanted to build a human, one who is empowered, healed, and an active agent of change. We wanted to build the next Syrian human. Yet, none of that was really possible at the time. You see, we were all refugees ourselves. We were all strategic leverages of change who needed empowerment before we can effectively help others. For me, personally, that empowerment came when I met who many of you know, a Catholic priest who many of you know as Father Dan Grudi on the Turkish-Syrian border. Father Dan helped me come here to Notre Dame and later joined our board of directors. At Notre Dame, I have and continue every day to learn about strategic peace building, locally led and context-sensitive development, and the cutting-edge advances in trauma therapy and emotion psychology. Through the legacy of Father Ted, embodied by Father Dan, I was empowered. It wasn't long before 3 of our founding members were in the US. Sarah is now a rising author and Middle Eastern Studies scholar in Chicago. Jamil is a community organizer and entrepreneur in Phoenix, and I here at Notre Dame. All of us getting empowered to funnel that empowerment through to our Syrian sisters and brothers around the world. And no, we did not forget about Maryam. In 2016, with the help of amazing volunteers at Notre Dame here and the Holy Cross Village senior community, we organized a fundraiser and raised $10,000 that went to establish the first female-led store and business in southern Turkey, managed entirely by Maryam and her group of torture survivors. Soon after, Maryam came to me and told me that she wanted to start a learning center. You see, through Notre Dame, I was empowered, and then through me, Maryam was empowered, and that's how it works. The snowball of empowerment kept rolling. When I first heard Maryam saying that, I balked at such a huge dream, but she didn't wait for me. She went on her own and mobilized the community and found a space, some equipment, and some volunteer teachers, and started a learning center. Soon after, we were able to jump in and provide some equipment and overhead costs and some technical support. Today, the Better Life Learning Center provides college and school prep, trauma therapy, and peace education to hundreds of Syrian refugee children and adolescents in Turkey. Father Ted once said, part of the movement for peace is bringing good out of evil. And if you are not at peace yourself, you cannot create peace. We Syrians are fully capable of leading our own processes of change, but We cannot do it alone. The first step of creating lasting positive change involves empowering resources already existing in the communities, and that is the people. To do that, the world needs to open their doors. If Father Ted was here, I believe he would say that a nation that cherishes freedom, indeed a nation that is built on freedom, should offer the people who have sacrificed everything for its sake not travel bans, not closed doors, but empowerment and open hearts. Shukran. Salam.
Where there is justice, you will have peace because people are being treated decently. Where you don't have justice, where you have injustice and oppression and lack of freedom, you have war. So it's wonderful to look back on your life, if you can, and say it's been dedicated to the tranquility of order, which is the work of peace.
Please welcome U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Prosecutor Tona Boyd.
As a prosecutor for the Civil Rights Division Criminal Section, I will never forget standing before my very first jury in Georgia and delivering my very first opening statement. So I am going to share just a snapshot of that with you guys today. The defendant, Police Chief Walter Young, thought that he was above the law. On March 24th, 2011, the defendant walked into the Tift County Jail in Tifton, Georgia. He approached a man who was seated in a restraint chair. Now that man had his hands cuffed behind his back. He had his legs strapped to the chair, and his face was covered with a white cloth spit mask. Now, as other officers stood by and watched in shock, the defendant, the chief of police, walked up to that fully restrained man and repeatedly punched and slapped him in the face. The defendant hit him over and over again until that white cloth spit mask turned red with his blood. Now, the defendant assaulted that fully restrained man in front of other officers and in front of the jail's video surveillance system. When those other officers tried to warn the defendant, they said, "Hey, we have video cameras in here." You're going to hear how the defendant responded. "I don't give a damn about the cameras." The words of a man who thought he was above the law. But we're here today, ladies and gentlemen, because no man is above the law. So thank you for indulging me and letting me do that one more time. I've always thought it's such a shame. You work so hard on these arguments, you agonize over the words, and then you only get to do it once in court. So thank you for humoring me today. As a federal civil rights prosecutor for the past 7.5 years, I have had the awesome privilege and responsibility of really working on a mission that is rooted in justice. I will never forget some of these awesome moments that I've had traveling around the country prosecuting these cases. Going and traveling across the state of Georgia to meet with victims who had been abused by the very people who were supposed to protect them, and trying to get them to trust and have faith in the system again. Or that time, the very first time I stood in court and said, "Tona Boyd on behalf of the United States." Those are moments that I will never forget. But the job was not without its challenges. Being a Black woman traveling to Georgia and to Louisiana to prosecute these cases, I was not always welcomed with open arms. including by the very people who were supposed to be on my team and to be my partners. And yet, I still had to find a way to work to push the cases forward and to work to endeavor to complete my mission. But in some way, despite those many challenges, it has been almost easy in a way to fight on behalf of justice while cloaked with my role at the United States Department of Justice. Just last week, I announced that I'm going to be leaving the DOJ and working on issues of justice and equality in another forum. In preparing for this talk, I have really reflected on Father Ted's words. How wonderful to look back on your life and to know that you were dedicated to the tranquility of order, to the work of peace. But how am I going to do that when I am no longer working towards the mission of the Department of Justice that I have worked so hard on? And how do we, as ordinary citizens, take up such a challenging call? And so in thinking about Father Ted's words, I was reminded of one of my heroes, an ordinary citizen who was an extraordinary woman, and that is my granny. So Mamie Jones was born in 1919 in Carpenter, Mississippi. She served in the United States Army and in the Air Force for 10 years, and she was the first African American to become a captain in her regiment during the Korean War. She later dedicated her life to federal service by serving as a nurse in the Veterans Administration. To say that my granny was a trailblazer does not begin to do her justice. Her strength of character, her fiery spirit, her true ability to overcome any obstacle in her way, whether that was the virulent racism that she faced in Mississippi, or handling a granddaughter who inherited some of her sass. She never backed down from a challenge. She truly embodied, to whom much is given, much is expected. She didn't let the fact that hospitals in Jackson, Mississippi would not hire a black nurse stop her from serving. She traveled as far as Los Angeles, California, in fact, in order to continue to work on her goals and to continue to serve. She really persisted in the face of great peril and strove to continue to fight for justice and peace in her own way. The great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "We begin to stop living the day that we are silent in the face of things that matter." There are so many injustices that face our world today, whether it's the plight of the poor, or people fleeing from war-torn countries, or families trying to educate their children with limited resources. We, as alumni of this great university, have been given so much. So let us not be silent in the face of things that matter. Instead, let us endeavor to live so that we can look back and say that we worked dedicated towards the tranquility of order, towards justice, and towards peace. What will you say? What will you do? How will your grandchildren remember you? Thank you.
I want to take this opportunity to thank you for attending our first ever Father Ted Said. I hope you found the presentations as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. Let's have another round of applause for our phenomenal speakers. Well deserved, very well deserved. Father Ted's words are as true today as they were all those years ago when he spoke them. So let's take this opportunity to one last time hear what Father Ted said.
It's been a wonderful series of years here at Notre Dame since I arrived in 1934. That's a long time ago. I never could have dreamed that first day of class what lay ahead, but that's just as good. Over the years, this university has brought me across oceans and all across the world to meet people who have helped change lives and make a better life for people in far forgotten places. I guess one could say that all of this was working for peace and peace through justice, whether it be civil rights or world development or food for the hungry or peace for those troubled in foreign lands. But especially I'm grateful for what our students continue to do right here. This is the heartland. This is where it all begins. And to be associated with so many wonderful students and later in their lives as alumni, as they try to change the lives of people who are suffering all kinds of iniquity around the world. I can't tell you how much good is being done by the Notre Dame alumni, both here and abroad, but it's a wonderful story. It's a story without end because it goes on yet today. And for all the grace and all of the blessings it entailed, I'd like to say a word of sincere thanks to our Lord and His Blessed Mother, Notre Dame.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.